There's a version of you that shows up to work, laughs at the right moments, agrees when agreement is easier than open conflict, and says, "I'm fine," more times a week than it's actually genuinely true. Most people assume that version is simply who they are, the whole picture, nothing hidden behind it. Carl Jung didn't think it was that simple, and he didn't arrive at that doubt from a textbook, a patient's case file, or a colleague's theory he happened to read. He arrived at it as a child, when he became convinced, quietly and privately, that he was actually two different people, living inside the same body without either one ever fully explaining the other. He never fully resolved which one of them was more real, and he carried that unresolved question with him well into old age, still writing about it in the final years of his life, still returning to it in his private journals, long after most people would have considered the question settled one way or the other. Decades after first noticing it as a boy, that unresolved question became one of the most useful psychological tools he ever developed, one that has almost nothing to do with lying, and almost everything to do with a mask most people never notice they're wearing until something forces them to look. Carl Jung wrote about this directly in his own late-life memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, composed with his colleague Agnella Jaffe when Jung was in his 80s, looking back across an entire career at the moment this pattern first became impossible for him to ignore. As a boy, he described experiencing himself as made up of two distinct personalities, which he simply labeled, with characteristic bluntness rather than any attempt at poetic euphemism, number one and number two. He wrote that he was, in his own words, alone as a child, in a way that went beyond ordinary childhood loneliness, because he felt he knew things and sensed things that the people around him seemed to have no interest in knowing at all. Number one, in his own description, was the ordinary schoolboy, a son who went to class, did reasonably well, and navigated daily life about as competently as any other child his age, someone his teachers and parents could point to and recognize without any confusion. Number two was something else entirely, a figure Jung described as far older than his actual years, remote from the everyday social world, but closely connected to nature, to dreams, and to what he called, without much embarrassment even decades later, God. He wrote that number two had no definable character in the ordinary sense at all, describing it instead as something closer to a total, timeless vision of life itself, born, living, and dead all at once. A description he was careful to note wasn't a metaphor he'd constructed for effect, but the closest language he could find for something he'd genuinely experienced as a child, long before he had any psychological training to make sense of it. If you're new to this channel, this is where we take one real teaching from one real thinker and break down not just the idea, but how to actually use it. Subscribe if that's useful to you, because we do this every week. Jung didn't stay a child who casually alternated back and forth between two separate internal identities. As he grew older, entered university, and eventually built a career as a respected Swiss psychiatrist, he found himself, by his own account, spending more and more of his daily life inside the number one identity. Competent, socially appropriate, professionally credible, the version of himself that could hold a job, run a household, and be taken seriously by colleagues in a field that was, at the time, still fighting hard for scientific legitimacy. Number two didn't disappear. He simply got pushed further out of daily view, tolerated mostly in private moments, in dreams, and eventually, decades later, in the extended personal crisis that produced his Red Book. Jung came to see this pattern not as something unique to his own unusual childhood, but as a near-universal feature of adult life. Everyone develops a version of themselves built specifically for functioning in society, a version shaped by what other people expect, reward, and find acceptable, that inevitably ends up covering over parts of the person that don't fit neatly into that role. This wasn't, in his view, a personal failing or a form of dishonesty. It was simply what happens to any human being who has to interact with other people, hold down responsibilities, and be predictable enough for a family, a workplace, or a community to function around, day after day, year after year, without constant renegotiation of who they're allowed to be. He eventually gave this outward-facing version a formal name, borrowed deliberately from the ancient world, choosing a word with a specific history he thought captured the phenomenon better than anything invented from scratch, and better than anything the emerging vocabulary of psychiatry had offered him at the time. Jung called it the persona, taking the word directly from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in classical theater, masks that projected a single, clear character to an audience seated far from the stage, regardless of who the actor actually was underneath it that particular evening, and regardless of what that actor happened to be feeling that particular night. He chose the word deliberately. The persona in his framework isn't fake exactly, and it isn't a lie in any simple sense. It's a necessary social tool, the face you present to the world so that daily life, work, and relationships can function smoothly without every private thought and feeling being on constant public display. Jung was always explicit that having a persona wasn't the problem. Every functioning adult needs one. A person with literally no persona at all, saying and displaying every unfiltered internal reaction at all times, would be, in practical terms, unable to hold a job, maintain a marriage, or function inside any organized social structure whatsoever. Imagine, for a moment, someone who genuinely said every critical thought about a coworker out loud the instant it occurred to them, or who broke into tears at their own private grief in the middle of every unrelated meeting. Society doesn't just discourage that kind of unfiltered display, it can barely accommodate it at all, which is exactly why Jung considered the persona a legitimate, necessary piece of psychological equipment rather than a flaw to be eliminated. No different in principle from any other genuinely useful skill a person deliberately develops specifically to function well among other people. The danger Jung identified was much more specific and much easier to fall into without noticing. Over-identifying with the persona so completely that a person forgets it's a mask at all and starts mistaking the professionally competent, socially agreeable performance for the entirety of who they actually are. The mask, in other words, isn't the problem. Forgetting you put it on is, and that forgetting rarely happens all at once. It happens gradually, one small compromise and one small performance at a time, until the line between the two has quietly disappeared. Jung described this over-identification using a term that still shows up regularly in clinical psychology today: inflation. Though in this specific case it works less like grandiosity and more like a quiet, gradual replacement, where the persona slowly crowds out everything underneath it until there's very little else left for a person to draw on. Someone who has spent decades being rewarded specifically for competence, composure, and reliability can end up genuinely unable to locate any other version of themselves when the professional role is removed, through retirement, job loss, or simply an ordinary weekend with nothing scheduled and no audience to perform the role for. This is, according to Jung's own clinical observations, one of the more common and least discussed sources of what looks, from the outside, like an inexplicable midlife crisis. It rarely announces itself as a crisis of persona. It shows up instead as a vague, persistent sense of emptiness in someone who has, by every conventional external measure, done everything correctly. Stable career, respected reputation, a role other people rely on and admire, a life that, on paper, checks every box anyone ever told them mattered. The problem, in Jung's framework, isn't that the persona failed. It's that it worked so completely for so long that the person built underneath it never got the chance to develop at all, leaving essentially nothing in reserve once the role that had been carrying their entire identity was set down. Even briefly, Jung treated this specific pattern, retirement collapse, sudden post-achievement emptiness, the successful person who can't explain why they feel hollow, as clinically significant rather than as simple ingratitude or a failure to appreciate one's own good fortune. In his view, it was the entirely predictable result of decades spent investing almost exclusively in one narrow version of a much larger person. He treated the collapse not as a sign that something had gone wrong recently, but as the delayed bill finally arriving for a much older, quieter decision made gradually over years to let one role do all the work that a whole personality was originally meant to carry. Jung noted that this pattern showed up with particular frequency among his patients in respected, high-visibility professions, precisely the roles that reward sustained persona performance most consistently and offer the fewest natural opportunities to set it down. Jung connected this directly to his broader theory of the shadow, the parts of a person's character they've pushed into the unconscious because those parts don't fit the persona they've built. The stronger and more polished the persona, in his observation, the larger and more neglected the shadow tends to become, simply because anything that doesn't fit the acceptable public performance has nowhere else to go except underground, out of conscious view but never actually gone, never fully resolved, simply waiting for an opening. This is part of why people who present as unfailingly calm and composed sometimes have the most sudden, disproportionate emotional outbursts when something finally breaks through. Not because the calm was fake in a cynical sense, but because it had been doing more structural work, covering more unexpressed material than anyone around them, including the person themselves, had realized. The outburst, when it comes, often looks wildly out of proportion to whatever small incident actually triggered it, precisely because it was never really about that specific incident at all. It was about years of material that the persona had been quietly holding back, with no other outlet ever built for it, until an ordinary, minor frustration finally became the excuse the pressure had been waiting for all along. Colleagues and family members are often the most confused by these moments, precisely because the persona had been so convincing for so long that nobody, including the person having the outburst, had any real framework for expecting it. Jung considered this confusion itself diagnostic. The more surprising an emotional reaction seems relative to someone's usual presentation, the more likely it is that the reaction is drawing on reserves that have been building, unaddressed, for a very long time, sometimes years, sometimes going back decades, to a version of the persona built early in adulthood and never seriously revisited since. Jung's own two-personality childhood experience previews this exact dynamic in miniature. Number 1 handled the visible, functional daily life, while number 2 carried everything that didn't fit inside that role, quietly, out of view, until it eventually demanded serious attention decades later during his personal crisis in his late 30s, the very crisis that produced the Red Book and, eventually, much of his mature theoretical work. It's a pattern he recognized in his patients, specifically because he had already lived through a version of it himself, long before he had any clinical language to describe what was happening. Modern self-help and career advice culture has taken pieces of this idea and flattened it down into something considerably more simplistic overall. The instruction to simply fake it till you make it, treating the persona as a costume you put on with no real cost, that eventually and automatically becomes who you actually are, through sheer repetition alone. Jung's own framework doesn't support that reading. Building professional competence through practice is genuinely useful, and Jung never argued otherwise. And there's real, legitimate value in acting confident before you fully feel it in a specific situation. What he warned against specifically was the unconscious, unexamined merging of the performed role with the entire self, with nothing held back or developed outside of it. The distinction matters because the advice sounds nearly identical on the surface, but points in opposite directions underneath. Fake it till you make it, as usually offered, treats the mask as the whole goal, the finish line itself. Perform confidence long enough, and there's nothing left to examine. The performance simply becomes reality by default. Jung's actual warning treats an unexamined mask as a genuine long-term risk to a person's psychological development, something to be worn consciously and set down deliberately, rather than something to disappear into without noticing you've done it. The difference isn't in whether you build a competent public self. It's in whether you remain aware, over years and decades, that you're the one wearing it, and that something else still exists underneath, waiting to be checked in on rather than permanently forgotten. So how do you actually notice where your own persona ends and the rest of you begins? Jung's framework offers a fairly direct, if uncomfortable, starting question. What do you do, feel, or want that would surprise the people who only know your professional or public self? If the honest answer is close to nothing, that gap itself, or rather the absence of one, is worth paying attention to. It doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong. It means the mask and the person underneath it have drifted close enough together that it's worth checking whether there's still a meaningful difference between the two. A second, related signal Jung pointed to is disproportionate identification with a job title, a role, or a reputation. The kind of identification where losing that specific position would feel less like a setback and more like losing your entire sense of who you are, permanently, without any obvious way to recover it. That intensity of attachment in his model is often a sign that the persona has absorbed more of a person's total identity than it was ever meant to carry safely on its own, leaving very little standing independently if that one role were ever removed by circumstance rather than by choice. A third signal, subtler than the first two, involves noticing how you actually spend genuinely unscheduled time with no professional purpose and no audience watching. Some people, when given a free afternoon with nothing required of them, discover they have almost no idea what they actually want to do, because every previous choice in their life had been organized around what the role required rather than around any preference that originated outside of it. Jung considered that particular kind of blankness not boredom exactly, but a genuine absence of any independent preference, one of the clearer warning signs that the persona has quietly become the whole operating system rather than one tool among several. A fourth, quieter signal involves language. Notice how often you describe yourself using your job title or role as if it were a complete sentence rather than one fact among many. "I'm a lawyer" functions very differently from "I practice law," and the difference, small as it sounds, often reveals how tightly a role has fused with a person's sense of identity. Jung wasn't interested in policing language for its own sake, but he did treat these small habitual phrases as genuine data, small surface signs of a much larger underlying structure worth examining honestly, the kind of pattern that's easy to overlook precisely because it sounds so ordinary and unremarkable in everyday conversation. Jung's proposed solution wasn't to abandon the persona entirely, which he considered both impossible and genuinely unwise given how necessary it is for functioning in daily life. It was to develop a conscious relationship with it, knowing clearly which parts of your public performance are a useful, deliberate tool, and which parts of yourself exist outside of it and need somewhere else to be expressed, developed, and taken seriously in their own right, not as a hobby squeezed into leftover time, but as a genuine part of who you are. In practice, this often looks less dramatic and less symbolic than people generally expect it to, deliberately maintaining interests, relationships, or forms of expression that have nothing to do with professional competence or public reputation, specifically because they don't need to perform for anyone. Something you're allowed to be genuinely, unapologetically bad at, with no professional reputation riding on the outcome, tends to serve this function particularly well, precisely because there's no persona attached to it that needs protecting or maintaining, no audience to disappoint, no version of yourself you're required to keep intact. Jung's own return to the material of his childhood. Number 2, personality later in life, through the deliberate practice of active imagination and the writing of the Red Book, was in many ways his own long-delayed answer to exactly this problem, making formal, deliberate space for the part of himself that his adult professional persona had spent years quietly crowding out. It's worth noting that he didn't do this publicly, and didn't do it as part of his professional reputation either. He did it privately, on his own time, in a journal he kept hidden from public view for the rest of his life, which is itself a fairly direct demonstration of his own advice. The part of you that exists outside the persona doesn't need an audience to be real or worthwhile, and doesn't need external validation to count as genuine self-development. A useful, concrete, practical version of this to actually apply. Pick one area of your life, outside of work and outside of how other people generally see you, and ask honestly how much real time and attention it currently gets, compared to how much of your identity depends on your public or professional role. Jung didn't consider this a one-time fix. He treated it, consistently across his writing, as ongoing maintenance, something that has to be revisited periodically as circumstances, roles, and responsibilities inevitably change across a lifetime. Because a persona that fit perfectly at 30 may not fit at all by 50. And a person who never checks in on that shift risks defending a mask that no longer has anything real left underneath it. There's also a relational version of this worth mentioning. People closest to you often notice the gap between persona and person long before you're willing to admit it exists yourself, precisely because they see you in more unscripted moments than colleagues or acquaintances ever do. Jung suggested that an honest conversation with someone who knows you well, asking directly whether they experience a noticeable difference between your public self and your private self, can surface information that's genuinely difficult to access through self-reflection alone, simply because a persona, by definition, is partly designed to be invisible to the person wearing it. A spouse, an old friend, or a sibling who's known you since before the professional persona was fully built, often has a clearer view of the gap than any amount of solitary journaling could ever provide on its own. The goal was never to discard the mask. Actors need masks to perform, and people need a functional public self to participate in society at all. The goal was simply knowing, with some regularity, that you're wearing one, and making sure something real still exists underneath it when you eventually set it down at the end of the day, rather than discovering, decades later, that there was nothing left underneath to find. Jung spent his entire adult life, by his own account, moving between the competent, socially functional, number one, and the older, stranger, less explainable, number two, he'd first noticed as a child, and he never fully resolved which one was the real him. He eventually stopped trying to make that choice at all, and built an entire framework instead around the idea that both were true simultaneously, and that the real danger was never having two sides. It was forgetting that the more polished, public one was ever a mask to begin with, and mistaking decades of successful performance for the entire truth of who he was. He returned to this theme repeatedly in his later writing, treating it less as a problem he'd solved once and for all, and more as a tension he'd learned to live inside of consciously, checking back in on it for the rest of his life rather than resolving it a single time and moving on. If some part of your own life currently exists only because someone else is watching, that's not necessarily a character flaw. It's exactly the pattern Jung spent his career trying to help people notice in themselves, before it went unexamined for decades, quietly hollowing out the very success it appeared, from the outside, to be built on. The mask isn't the enemy, forgetting it's there is. If this kind of breakdown of real ideas from real thinkers is useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications because we're doing this every week. Tell us in the comments, is there a version of you that almost nobody else ever gets to see?